It is a great honor to be joined by Jeffrey Frank. He recently authored a wonderful book on I'm not sure if it's the 33rd or the 34th president or 35th. Um, the Trials of Harry S. Truman, The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man, 1945 to 1953. How are you today, Jeffrey? Thank
Yeah,
you for joining us.
it's my pleasure to be here.
Okay. So, first question. So to what extent is Harry S. Truman an ordinary man, and to what extent is his presidency extraordinary?
Well, he's an ordinary man in the sense that his background, particularly in that time in the United States, was really ordinary. He was someone who he'd grown up in the Middle West, in sort of a rural part of the Midwest. He had never gone to college, which was actually a rare thing for 20th century president, for modern day presidents. And he was not someone who'd given a lot of thought to the world beyond his beyond his hometown. He was very smart. He was very intelligent. He was a big reader of almost anything he could get his hands on. But he was not someone. He was not someone who was, for example, Franklin Roosevelt he was an extraordinary man. He was a man who was in almost every way, in his carriage, his voice, his background, and so he was almost in a way the mirror opposite of Harry Truman. Though in many ways they were similar, and they had a similar wishes for the country and for the world.
Mhm. Right. So I just checked. He was the 33rd president of the United States.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I should have jumped in to say it. Yes, yes, yes.
So it it would be tough for Truman, considering that he was sandwiched between two great figures as presidents, right? Delano Roosevelt as his predecessor, and then Eisenhower as his successor. So people may not remember him as fondly as the other two.
Well, I mean, I think history is, as you know, history. As time goes by, you begin to look back, and people begin to look different. They can become bigger or smaller. And Truman was one of those people who I think began to look bigger as you look back. And it was his great misfortune in a way to follow Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a really big man. Roosevelt had been president for three full terms and a little bit of a fourth term, which was completely unprecedented. No president
Mhm.
before him and since, and no president will ever in the future have more than two terms. There was a constitutional amendment was passed to limit the presidency to two terms, and so Roosevelt was someone who had transformed the country. Eisenhower was a different kind of. Eisenhower is different, and Eisenhower had his detractors too, but he was big in a different way. He was a world famous general, and he was the one who had led the Allied forces in the Second World War, and Eisenhower had many great personal qualities, but he didn't have the substance of the presidential authority of Franklin Roosevelt. But that was Truman's great hurdle to sort of take over when suddenly Roosevelt died, and after Truman had been his vice president for 3 months, and then to suddenly be told that you're now the president of the United States, which was now at that moment the most by far the most powerful nation in the world in a way that it hasn't been since. The size and authority of the United States was at its absolute peak in 1945.
Mhm. Well, the movie Oppenheimer recently came out, and of course,
Yeah, yeah.
President Truman was overseeing the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I wonder if the movie may prompt a reevaluation of Truman's role in that particular incident, and if so, what was his role in it?
No, not at all. The rumors, the movie sort of misrepresents Truman. It makes him kind of a comic character and a kind of a little character. No, as I in the book, I make the point that in fact this was not a big decision for Truman. It was made for him.
Hmm.
There was, you can think it was a horrible thing, and I think Truman acknowledged it was a horrible thing, though he never said he never had any regrets. But he had no choice. This thing had been in the works for years. we were at war with Japan was the hated enemy that had attacked the United States. Truman had been warned that if we had to have a land invasion of Japan, it might cost as many as 500,000 lives. That wasn't true. That was a silly. I mean, that was not so. That was a great exaggeration. But no, as the commander in chief, it was his responsibility to look out for American soldiers, and it was his responsibility to try to end the war as quickly as possible. So there was no question that it would go ahead. It wasn't, the decision had been made much earlier. There was the interim committee, which was a very innocuous name for a group that basically their decision was, are we going to go ahead with this? That was their decision. There was not one dissenting voice. No one had a question, a scintilla of doubt that they were going to go ahead with this. And then there was the Target Committee, and this was where the big decision, where the only real decision came in. The Target Committee was going to drop the bomb. The first choice was Kyoto. And the idea of dropping it on Kyoto was this, I've been there, it's this beautiful city of shrines and temples and has zero military value. And the argument for dropping it on Kyoto, this would really demoralize the Japanese. And Secretary of War Stimson, who had been there, made the argument that the Japanese will never forgive us if we did something something like that. And Truman it went off the list. So Hiroshima became the number one, probably the number one target on the list. The second bomb on Nagasaki is much more problematic. It's not even clear who gave the order. In a way, Truman gave the original order, but someone had to say, go ahead and drop the second bomb. And I'm not quite sure. No one's quite sure who did it. It was sort of in process. And if there had been a third bomb, which there might have been, that would have been all on Truman, but he didn't do it.
Yeah, it's a very
well, mainly because Japan surrendered very soon after the Nagasaki bomb.
And how did Truman, I guess, in retrospect, think of the decision? Does he believe in the all-American consensus these days that is a necessary catastrophe, so to speak?
It's hard to say. I mean, as soon as the bomb was dropped, no one realized what this thing was. I mean, or how powerful it was, how awful it was. And as soon as it happened, suddenly there were editorials being written of how horrible it was, how never in history had so many people been killed in an instant, and so on. And people began to really second guess this they realized this was the most terrible weapon that had ever been developed. And I think he never regretted it, or he never said, or he never publicly regretted it. He always said, he would say things like, it was a horrible thing, but I would do it again. And I'm not sure how deeply he felt that. I got to know his grandson, Clifton Daniel, and he became rather obsessed by it. He visited Hiroshima several times, and he got to know a relative of the girl who was going to fold 1,000 trains. You know the story, and it was and she had been injured by the bomb in Hiroshima, and she didn't finish her work. She died of radiation poisoning several years before. And Clifton Daniel, Truman's grandson, brought one of the little cranes, paper cranes back. I can't show you here. They're how small they are. They're about as small as a finger. And he brought one back from Japan and is now actually in the Truman Museum in Independence, Missouri. And so there's a history there that I think, I'm not Daniel. He never said it was wrong. But he obviously was deeply emotionally affected by this, by what his grandfather did.
You mentioned that Kyoto was initially chosen as a target, but because Secretary of War Henry Stimson vacationed in it thankfully was spared, and is one of those historical accidents that it can be quite mind-blowing. And which brings me to another historical accident in that Truman was not first on the list to be vice president in FDR's fourth presidential run. The other man was one Henry Wallace, and had it been the case, then we would have a President Henry Wallace, and we could get to the historical implications of that. But how did
Yeah.
FDR settled with Truman instead of Wallace?
Yeah, actually, it's not even clear that Henry Wallace was next on the list. Well, FDR Roosevelt was a very crafty guy, and he was he'd actually promised it to Wallace. Wallace, who was the incumbent, he'd been the vice president, and he promised it to a man named James Francis Burns, who, by the way, if had he been president, we would have had a rabid segregationist who would have he would have been a ghastly president. But but Roosevelt had thought enough of him to make him give him a huge job in his administration, in charge of domestic policy during the war, and he even put him on the Supreme Court. By the way, he may have been the only modern Supreme Court justice who never finished high school. These were different times. Henry Wallace was so Wallace had promised. I mean, Roosevelt had promised both of them, and of course, Roosevelt lied and lied to them, and he was persuaded by his advisors. You can't do this. Wallace was considered a risky and slightly flaky person, and he was considered sort of too soft on the Soviet Union. He wasn't. Some people even thought he was a fellow traveler. He wasn't, but he was definitely an independent thinker. And there was a meeting on a hot night in July, and they gathered around the office and they settled on Truman. And Truman had many advantages. He wasn't first place. He wasn't Wallace, and he wasn't Burns. He was a Midwesterner, and he was he was a little bit. He was younger than Roosevelt. Burns was actually older than Roosevelt, and Labor liked him. Labor did not like Burns. He was okay on the race issue. He was a racist. Truman was a racist by any modern standard, but he wasn't someone like Burns who would stand up and argue against repealing the lynch laws. So Truman was a perfect choice, and he was a Midwesterner. So he was this. And oh, I should say one more thing. He was also a pretty well-known quantity. He was a second-term senator. His first term was basically a washout. No one remembers what he did. But in the second term, he had come up with the idea of having a committee to sort of watch out for, to sort of monitor wage, fraud, abuse, basically stealing in the defense industry. And this was even before the war. And this became the Truman Committee, and it was very successful. He saved millions and millions of dollars from wasteful defense spending. And he got on the cover of Time magazine. So he was someone who people had begun to know. So he was a very sensible choice for Roosevelt. Did he have any presidential qualifications? No. But no one thought he was going to be president. I mean, well, that's not true. Some people worried that Roosevelt was very ill. Roosevelt would never admit to himself that he was ill.
Yeah, so I'd like to follow up on that. So Roosevelt won his fourth term in 1944, and he passed away a year later.
Yeah.
So I wonder when.
3 months. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
3 months after the inauguration. Yeah.
Wow. So I wonder if when Roosevelt was going through his list for running mates, do any of his potential running mates know that they might be president because of this, because of his untimely future passing?
Oh, I have no doubt that people close to Roosevelt could see how weak he looked, how thin he looked, how someone said he was listening to him speak was like listening to a record slowed down to 33 RPM when it was a 78. He would speak very slowly. You could tell, but only people close to him could see this. When he gave a speech, he could rise to the occasion in every way. He became the old Roosevelt. He gave a very famous speech in which he basically said was attacking Republicans who had attacked him and said they're even going after my dog Fala. That became one of his sort of signature speeches, and so there was no question that only the people knew next to him knew. But yes, I'm sure that Jimmy Burns, as he was called, could smell it. He could smell it. He was, and I think when Truman became president, he was deeply envious. Henry Wallace probably had the same thing. People, I mean, whether he was going to die or not, of course, no one knew. But his mortality was very obvious to anyone close to him.
I think following up on that Roosevelt point, I think it was Nixon who has a dog named Chester or Chestnut, and people were attacking him when either he was vice president or he was running, and he said, "Well, you can attack me all you want, but don't touch my dog Chester." He's
No, it was, no, no, but it wasn't. It wasn't. Suddenly the name eludes me, but no, it wasn't Chester. It was, but it was. It was it wasn't Freckles. It was what is Patches. I mean, it wasn't Patches. It was something to do with his coat. No, he did say it, and he definitely was inspired by Roosevelt. And that's Nixon was one of the great political speeches of all time. It was considered very modern. Checkers. I'm sorry,
Checkers.
dog.
Yes.
You threw me off with the yeah. His dog Checkers, and it was it's worth going online to watch this speech. It was brilliant. I mean, people made fun of it. People still make fun of it, but it saved his career. And I wrote the book before this one. I wrote about the relationship between Eisenhower and Nixon, and that was that's a very it was a very interesting time. And yeah, Nixon was just about to be dumped from the tent, but he stayed and he thrived
Mm-hmm.
for a time.
It's very interesting in the presidential election of 1960, I believe, when Nixon was going up against John F. Kennedy, and is quite fascinating to see that even though Kennedy was basically born with one too many silver spoons in his mouth, he was considered the man of the people, whereas Nixon, who grew up poor, is considered, the face of the establishment.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, Nixon had a lot of appeal to the Republican base as it still is, and Kennedy was people were suspicious of Kennedy precisely because he was the Ivy League education. He was a Catholic, which was America was never going to elect a Catholic. And so no, and they were very similar in many ways. They came to Congress the same year, 1946. They were friends. Nixon went to Kennedy's wedding when he married Jacqueline. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, supported Nixon, gave money to one of Nixon's campaigns, and so they were friendly. Their offices were right across. Nixon's office as vice president was right across from Senator Kennedy's office, and they were friends. I mean, that's the only word you can use. And that they had a falling out when they faced each other in 1960, and they were basically the same age, the same demographic, the same. Their politics were not all that different. I mean, Democrats and Republicans were not that were very similar then in many ways. I mean, the Democrats included these sort of Southern segregationists, and the Republicans included many of these liberal Easterners and Westerners. And Nixon, when he ran, Nixon himself would attack the sort of right wing of the Republican Party. Nixon was a classic moderate with some bad behavior on his part.
Yes, and unfortunately, that tanked him in a very Greek tragedy manner.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying, by the way, when I wrote about Nixon and Eisenhower, I stayed within the parameters of their relationship, and Eisenhower died 3 months into the Nixon presidency. Nixon's presidency for the first 3 months was pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, going back to Henry Wallace, with the benefit of hindsight, to what extent was he sympathetic to communism?
Oh, I don't think he was at all. I think what he was, I think that he really considered Russia a good wartime ally, and I think he thought that they could be a long time alliance, and people still argue this case. The people still argue that that Truman's responsible for the Cold War, and that if Henry Wallace had been president, things wouldn't have evolved that way. And who knows? Would Russia have continued on this pattern that they began to show later on? Would they become expansionist or something? I don't know. No one will know. But that's the fascination of alternative history, and how a Wallace presidency would have developed, who knows? But Wallace was not a communist, but he was definitely interested in a very early strong détente with the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. So, So to what extent was Truman, I guess, aware of Soviet communism as a long-term enemy? Yeah.
Oh, I mean, he was open to the idea almost from the start, and he became a real pretty fast a real cold warrior when the British cut off aid to Greece and Turkey, and Truman was persuaded by his advisors to step in because my goodness, the Soviet Union was going to encroach, which was, by the way, not it was very unlikely at that time, and there was a guerrilla war in Greece, and there was simply no obvious influence from Russia in Turkey. But nevertheless, Truman was persuaded that this was important. Dean Acheson, who was an assistant secretary of state at the time, was and George Marshall. They said you have to do this, and Truman went before Congress and he asked for $400 million to sort of give aid mostly to Greece, not military aid, but aid. And that was that. And then he made a speech basically any country that's threatened we stand behind them. And he was speaking. The reference to the Soviet Union was pretty clear.
Mhm.
And then a year later, when the Marshall Plan was introduced, then the lines, as they say, were really drawn between East and West.
Mhm. Right. So going back a little bit, so how did Harry Truman made the Democratic Party his home?
Well, I mean, he was born. He was a Missouri Democrat from birth. I mean, and there was no. It was never any doubt that he was a Democrat. He was a Democrat when he grew up in Jackson County, and when the slightly corrupt Pendergast organization had recruited him to run for the Senate in 1946. I'm sorry, not 1944. I'm sorry, that's it. 1934 was his first term. 1940 he ran for a second term, and he was a Democrat, and the Democrats and he was loyal to the party. The party was loyal to him,
Mhm.
and there was never question about it. He was a pretty partisan guy too. He really would go after Republicans, even though he depended on Republicans for his major policies.
Mhm. Well, so oh, sorry, I forgot my train of thought, but it'll be
No,
back.
no.
Um, right. So give us an overview of the United States of America that Harry Truman inherited from FDR.
Well, I mean, there's a wonderful book called Inside USA by a man named John Gunther, who basically did it. It was like a time. If you look at it today, it's like a time capsule. I think some people are sort of discovering it, and it was a different country. It was a country. It was first place. It was a country of about 135 million people. Now it's a country of 320 million people. It was a much more rural country. It was a much more. It was much more it was a much more of a white country than it. I mean, in the sense that there was no women didn't have much influence, so they had the vote, but they were assigned to the home. African Americans were very had. There were no African American senators. There were a couple of African American congressmen, one of whom Adam Clayton Powell, ran into had a big sort of fight with Truman. He insulted Truman's wife with good reason, by the way, and Truman used the N word all the time in Providence. So that was there was that kind of country then. It was not Truman, by the way, was made a real effort to sort of encourage civil rights and so on. But this was he knew what the right thing to do was because he was president, but his personal views were terribly, by modern standards, would be considered racist. It was a much more, it was a country it was a country that was recovering from the war, and it was a country that was recovering in a way that no other country was. New York, the United States had not been attacked. Had not been attacked. The death toll of American soldiers was under 400,000. I think 800,000 Poles were killed in Warsaw. I mean, 800,000 Poles lost their lives in just one city, Warsaw. So it was a country that had to suffer, but in nearly the way other countries hadn't been blitzed like the United Kingdom had, and it was a country that was really becoming very, very powerful. the war industry had sort of spurred so many other things. The auto industry came booming. The economy began to boom. It became this hugely profitable, I mean, sort of rich country. And then the GI Bill sort of created a whole generation of college graduates, paying their tuition and so on. So it was a very, I'm not going to say it was a happy country because so many people were unhappy, but for the white majority, it was a very prosperous, happy country.
Well, so you
And a
have
smaller country.
so you have these two opposite currents, right? In that one, the United States of America suffered massive loss of life because of all the young men being drafted into war and pass away.
But nothing, but right, I was trying to make, but nothing compared to what the Russians lost 20 million people.
Mhm.
I mean, there's no comparison to what the Americans suffered as to what was the death rate of the casualties in Europe.
So
I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you, but I just want to say, America came out of that war in pretty good shape.
yes,
Yeah.
and I think I talked to another person on this podcast. I think it was Professor Gary Morrison of Northwestern University, and he
Yeah.
was saying that the Soviet Union had an entirely different view of what happened after World War II because, well, they've lost so many people, and perhaps
Yeah.
the influence of Soviet communism gave them a bleaker view of what the war was and is. Um, um, but nonetheless, on the other hand, America became this global superpower, and
Yeah.
maybe because of that, Truman was eager to implement the Marshall Plan, which um, obviously started the Cold War as we know it. Um, why?
I
Yeah.
don't know. The Cold War Cold War was already in progress, or was being born as the Marshall Plan was introduced. So, sorry to interrupt you, but yeah,
Okay.
but the Marshall Plan was, and also, by the way, I want to just say that Truman had very little to do with the Marshall Plan, except that he signed it and so on. But I can go into that.
Mhm. Nevertheless, he
Okay.
okay with it, and of course, I
Oh,
said,
of course, they took credit for it, of course.
of course, I stand corrected in the whole Cold War timeline, but um, he was um, he was not hesitant to, I guess, enter into this state of hostility with the Soviet Union, knowing full well that it may result in, a hot war, so to speak, and further loss of life. So, um, I wonder how would he, I guess, what was his rationale to like continue this the state of hostility rather than just be at peace with Soviet communism in Eastern Europe?
I don't think. Yeah, I would put it that way. The first real chance to have a hot war came during the so-called the first Berlin crisis, when when Stalin basically blockaded almost all the entries into Berlin. Berlin, as you know, was in Eastern Germany, which was Russian. Sorry, and there was this little island within this big territory, and Truman very judiciously and wisely, they decided Russia was not blocking air traffic, so the so-called the sort of airlift into Berlin began, and that was very successful, and that avoided a shooting war. No one wanted a shooting war. There couldn't. The United States would have definitely lost a ground war in that part of the country. It was in Eastern. We couldn't have fought it anyway, and everyone understood that, and no one wanted it. No one wanted a hot war. Truman certainly did not want a hot war, and certainly, even though at that point, the United States, the superiority, the United States also had the nuclear monopoly, which didn't change. That changed in the late summer, early fall of 1949. So there was a period there when it would have been unthinkable for anyone to have to attack the U.S. I don't know that I don't know that that Truman wanted that. The first occasion when there really was engagement, of sort of a hot war engagement, was Korea, and that came in the early summer of 1950.
Mhm.
but there was always tension. I mean, there were standoffs. There were and bluffs, and particularly in these sort of so-called hot spots like Berlin. And there was also and there was Stalin. Stalin worried. I mean, Stalin was very annoyed that we had the U.S. had the bomb and he didn't, and so he put on a sort of crash program to develop it, and Stalin's relationship with Truman wasn't terribly good, particularly after Winston Churchill came to visit the United States and made a speech that sort of announced the Iron Curtain, and I'm talking about the sort of the ghastly part of the world that sits on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and he was sitting next to Truman, who was applauding this speech. This all got back to Stalin, who got very upset. Truman invited him to come over too, but Stalin didn't decided not to come. But would never considered coming. But anyway, though that was the situation. But Truman, no one was wanted a war with Russia. Some people thought it was inevitable, and that was in the air. But Truman certainly didn't want that.
After the year 19.
Oh, I'm sorry. But I haven't mentioned the containment idea, the George. Yeah, and that was really the philosophy. I can use the word philosophy. They to contain the Soviet Union so that more territory wouldn't turn red. I'm sorry, and to sort of preserve the status quo as much as possible.
I think George Frost Cannon lived through the Cold War, and he would repeatedly argue that, well, the presidents that succeeded Truman and onward to, I guess, Reagan, misunderstood what he meant by containment. But if we understood containment the way Kennan understood it in his long telegram, the sources of Soviet conduct and everything, did Truman adhere to Kennan's view of containment in all is fidelity?
Yeah, I'm not sure that Truman understood it either fully, and then it became modified. There was then the sort of policy, the sort of the idea that the Soviet later on the idea that the Soviet Union, NSC 68, this policy paper that the Soviet Union was this seeking total control, basically world domination, and this thing sort of became the accepted way to look at the world. I think Truman sort of followed this. Kennan thought some of it was a bit silly. Kennan thought that the Russians, even if the Russians did want to control the world, they couldn't. They didn't have the manpower or the economic strength to do such a thing. So there's a lot of rhetoric about it then, and I'm not sure that anyone gave it, really thought where it was going to lead. I mean, Kennan certainly did not want war with the Soviet Union. Kennan certainly thought that he understood Russia and the Russian motives better than most people, and he did understand Russia right up to the end. I mean, right up as most recently with the expansion of NATO. Kennan wrote and said this was the most disastrous policy mistakes since the war. Nothing was going to do more to antagonize Russia and sort of increase tensions than something like that, which would push NATO countries right up to the Russian border in a more aggressive way. So Kennan did not want conflict or confrontation with Russia. What he did want was sort of a sane settling into containment of their territorial ambitions.
Perhaps what Kennan quarreled with the most is that this NSC 68 document, which became like the norm of U.S. foreign policy in assuming that the Soviet Union is going to expand. Well, in certain cases, it can be correct because Soviet communism is not like a nationalist idea, and I think there was a vision between Stalin and Trotsky about whether to keep it national or to put it international. But nevertheless, with the case of Hungary in 56 and Czechoslovakia in 68, it can be assumed that there are some territorial ambitions with the ideology, if not Soviet nationalism
Oh,
itself.
oh yeah, the Soviet Union. I mean, and also there's no question that Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all that Stalin wanted these under Soviet control, and there's, I mean, and they stayed that way until until the Gorbachev era, as you know. No, I don't know what, and so, but that these this was all this was I mean, don't you think this sort of happened after this was after the war? The war was that was sort of war booty in a way,
Mm-hmm.
was Eastern Europe, and that was and did Roosevelt basically said it's yours. He didn't say it directly, but there was he made it, the understanding with Stalin was Eastern Europe's yours, Western Europe is ours, and it was never said quite that way, but that was an understanding, and I think that's what and that's still to this. Stalin sort of said, I think at one point when they were discussing during the Potsdam conference the status of Poland, he said that every invasion of Russia came through Poland. The Germans came through Poland. So he was all a lot of, it was a question of borders and protection, and obviously he wants, and obviously control. And this ghastly system, communism, was just, of course, everyone. The misfortune was anyone could see how awful it was. The division of Berlin. Finally, you look over this wall, you see this prosperous, glittering Western Savin and this sad, poor, dark other half, and that was in a way Stalin's real worry when they set up the blockade of Berlin. The West was going to combine the currencies of France, Germany, England, and then it was this have a single stable Deutschmark, and the other side you had this pathetic ruble, and he could see the future. He wasn't dumb, Stalin. Quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm. And I think Cannon's insights and views are hopelessly ignored during this current Russo-Ukraine war. I think because if anyone understood Russia, it was Cannon, and we have a lot of wrong-headed insight both in the pro-Ukraine and the anti-Ukraine, I suppose, factions of the U.S. and I think for the most part, what the pro-Ukraine side gets wrong is that they keep assuming that Russia is pursuing expansionism, and unlike the Soviet Union, where I highly doubt that it is the case at this point.
Yeah, I don't. That's an interesting thing. I mean, what does Putin want? I mean, it was a. I mean, I don't. Obviously, he doesn't like the idea that the Ukraine is now an independent country called Ukraine, and but on the other hand, their ties are historic, long. There's a 3,000-mile border between these two countries. I've only been to Ukraine once, and you could just and that was a long time ago, but it was still the Ukraine. But the nationalism was so obvious, and they even in a room with Russians, though they all spoke Russian, the Ukrainians would speak Ukrainian and hold on to that and so on. So what do you think Putin wants? Do you think do you think he wants he wants what he wants? He doesn't like the idea of an independent Ukraine, does he?
I think he wants another Yanukovych. I think that's what I've come to realize. I think he's okay. He's okay with an independent Ukraine, but only if the president is a buddy of his, kind of like Lukashenko is doing right now.
Yeah. Do you think that if the United States had announced, and I mean, this is that there is no way on God's earth that Ukraine is going to become a member of NATO, that would have helped sort of stabilize things too. I mean, had announced that well in advance of the invasion.
I think it would be a first step towards going on the negotiating table. I think ideally, and this would be something that if say not to be presumptuous, but if I was say in the position to influence U.S. foreign policy, I would say you give up on Ukraine ever becoming a member of NATO, and then persuade the Russian Putin to give up on the autonomous region, and then we can proceed from there.
Right, right. I mean, I don't. I agree with you, and I also think there's no way that Russia is going to give up Crimea.
Mhm.
That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. But so therefore, I don't know. I don't know what you do to prevent this from being this ghastly stalemate that's going to go on and go on. And the more you add new weapons to this conflict, the nastier and deadlier it gets, and the less likely an early outcome. But I don't. I'm not making foreign policy. Unfortunately, I would probably. I might. I know. I mean, it's. I think. But it's almost too late now. I mean, to go back to the status quo ante, don't you think?
Oh yes, yes. I think
Yeah.
that's gone since March of 2022.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so to risk us diving into territories that we are way out of our depths about, let's return to Truman. Um, I think the presidency of Truman is, from my point of view, America growing to accept its role as, well, a global superpower. That
Yeah.
means that every every and any of its decision in the global sphere is going to massively impact the world. And I think isolationism, if it is purely understood and not just a term of derision thrown about, it's a luxury that Americans cannot afford. So how did Truman, brought America into the world order? How did he see America's role in the international stage?
Yeah. I mean, I think that happened with World War II. Roosevelt brought America into the world. Roosevelt had to deal with isolationism, which was very powerful until America. Once America entered the war, America entered the world, and uh, and it was inevitable. And by the time of the what became the last Big Three conference in Potsdam in the summer of 1945, then you could see that this new world was there. I mean, it was Britain, the United States, I guess France, and the Soviet Union and China, which then was nationalist China, and so I and but there was no going back. I don't think at that time. No one's even suggested that there was any way back. That America was going to have a major role in the world. I mean, then it became a question of how big a role, how will it be a military role, and how much and how involved are we going to get in foreign military conflicts at the conflicts. And in my book, I write a lot about Korea. I became rather obsessed with Korea because you could almost say Korea was our first war in which we really had no stake whatsoever.
Mhm.
And yet, at the end, it became a horrible slaughter of Koreans, North and South. 37,000 Americans were killed there. And it created the undying enmity of North Korea. Kim Il Sung, who was the great leader then, he's the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, and they hate us. They hate us because we totally destroyed that country during the war, and this was a war with no point. The point was, of course, to push the communists back, to push the North Koreans back over the border. The border at that point was the so-called was the 38th parallel. And I've often said it's very similar. I make an analogy between that and the first Gulf War, in which the goal was to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And that was, for better or worse, that was the limited war. It was the point of the war, and that ended the war. In Korea, the point of the war was to push the North Koreans over the 30th parallel back, and that would have ended the war. But what happened was the war became a bigger war. It became a regime change war, and that became almost a paradigm of future wars. And you could almost say Vietnam, Afghanistan, so on and so on. And that was a turning point for this country. And I thought, and I think, and so that's another how he entered the world in a big way, and maybe not always in a good way.
I think it was Korea was the first test case of what containment is in practice. And in my view, it was China who was more instrumental to North Korea maintaining its presence in the north, the Kim family and such, rather than the Soviet Union. In fact, China won more than the Soviet. The Soviets kind of lost in that one.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, the Soviet Union was definitely involved in urging the North Koreans to go ahead, even though Stalin wanted to have no, there was wanted to keep, there was no fingerprints, as they say, even though, but he had a meeting, but there was no, the North, I mean, the North had no, no, North wanted to unify the country under Northern auspices, and yes, as you say, China had much more interest in that happening. China didn't want to get involved in the war at that point either. They sent strong warnings: don't cross the 38th parallel, don't come close to China. And if the U.S. had kept its limited goal to push the North back across the parallel, there would not have been a major Korean War, and the Chinese would never have entered the war.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows? I mean, history is, we don't know. We still don't know. But no, Russia definitely had a role in it. Dean Acheson put it all on Russia, because he was obsessed with Russia as the country that was the sort of the rotten apple that was going to ruin everything wherever they. But they didn't ruin everything. They didn't ruin France. They didn't ruin Italy. They didn't, they limited. They were limited to Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I think what Truman inherited from FDR was also this vision of a liberal international order. FDR and also Eleanor was instrumental in the creation of the United Nations, and I suppose
that's true.
Truman wanted to maintain that, but nevertheless, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. His vision of the liberal international order is in itself a conflict between the ideals of having every nation determining its own fates, every people determining who should rule them, and we should all live as nation states. But his vision was clashed with the realities of superpower politics at that time, in that the world is divided into three, I guess, alliance systems. I guess the U.S. allied system that later became NATO, the Soviet allied system, the Warsaw Pact, and then the non-allied aligned movement. So how did Truman see this one through?
I'm not sure that he saw. I think sometimes history just happens to you. Mm-hmm. Truman definitely was for the United Nations. He was very, it meant a lot to him, and he really respected Roosevelt's wish to have this international order. I think that in terms of what these sort of different alliances, NATO came a bit later. NATO started as a European grouping, and then the United States endorsed it, and the so-called Vandenberg Resolution, and then NATO was formed. But that came later when the after NS, I think it was after, no, it was before NSC 68, but it was after the Truman Doctrine, which was the aid to Greece and Turkey, and so it was inevitably going to be a sort of Western thing, and then the East. So all these different groups or bodies, I'm not sure they sort of. I'm trying to think of it. It's almost like sort of gravity sort of pulled all these different countries and interest into different orbits, but I think it just sort of, history kind of happened in some sense then.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Truman had any great vision of a great Western alliance, but it happened, and I think possibly NSC 68, that was later on. Yes, we'll have this huge force to combat the communism and so on.
Mm-hmm. So, give us an overview of the presidential election of 1948, which is the one and the only one that Truman won. His opponent was from the Republican side was Thomas Dewey, governor of New York. Right. So how did that go about?
Well, by the way, the Republicans had a very strong ticket. The vice president was Earl Warren, who later became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was governor of California. And all the polls said that Truman wasn't going to do it. Truman was very unpopular. he'd only been president at that point. He'd had a pretty good record by that time. Because the Marshall Plan and NATO was not yet, but it was in the works. The economy was doing okay, but Truman was a very unprepossessing figure. He looks big in retrospect, but at the time he seemed like a little man. He had a sort of high pitched nasal voice. I mean, he was the complete mirror opposite of Roosevelt. And the Democrats had been around too long, so no one thought Truman had a chance of winning. And what happened was he won. And the people say, oh well, the polls were awful. The polls were probably right. The polls reflected what the famous poll, the Earl Roper poll, was. I think it was taken in late September of 1948, and Dewey was way ahead. That was probably accurate, but if they'd taken a poll the day before the election, it probably would have shown a great movement toward the Democrats. And Dewey was not a very appealing candidate. He had a little mustache. He sounded like someone who wasn't in touch with the people. Truman's great gift was Truman was a terrible speaker on radio, which television wasn't much of a force then. But he was a great campaigner. He loved getting out on the campaign and railing against the Republicans, and he was very good at it. And people liked him. People kind of liked him. He was the local guy who made good. And so I think there was a lot of just personal appeal. The issues weren't that important. The issues became much more important 4 years later when it became Korea. Perception of corruption in the Truman government and so on, but no, then it was just, but Truman was seen, as a little guy who had done some good things, and he stood up and he'd come through, and people realized this is a guy who had suddenly taken over when Roosevelt died, and he stood up and he's done his job, and that's a big deal. But yeah, I can't read minds, but I say I'm sure the polls were accurate up until as far as they went, but there again, I can't prove that.
Mhm. Well,
I do know that in later elections, for example, in 1960, for example, Nixon was way ahead, and then at the end there were about 4 votes separating them. And the same thing happened with later on with the Hubert Humphrey and Nixon in '68. To use the cliche, with razor thin margin, even though Nixon was way ahead after the conventions.
yeah. I think we've touched on this earlier, but give us an idea of how the Republican Party and the Democratic Party at the time, Truman and Dewey, and how different those two parties are to our current Democratic and Republican parties.
Well, there's no comparison. In 1940, Roosevelt ran against a guy named Wendell Willkie, who was basically supported Roosevelt. They actually met. There was actually talk about in some future day of having Willkie become a vice president, and he was a progressive Republican who believed in the United Nations and sort of one world Republican, unheard of today. And he came, and so he was there, and Eisenhower was a moderate Republican. Eisenhower was sort of, looking back on him, he was a great president and moderate views and a great temperament. And today we have, as far as I'm concerned, we have the Democratic Party, which is all over the place, but no longer, but has lost its segregationist right wing. They've become Republicans, and the Republican Party was just turning more and more into a cult.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, I can't think any other word for it. There's some good Republicans around, but they're not going to win anything, and they're being dominated by this one weird figure whose name never appears once in my book because there's no reason for it to.
I think one thing that I guess conservative historiography, if you read the book called The Right by Matthew Continetti, he sort of compares the sort of Truman hawkish Democratic Party to, I guess, the Democratic Party of, say, Jimmy Carter or Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. after Vietnam, the Democratic Party seems to be the anti-war party compared to what Truman was. Well, I think in the Democratic Party of Biden, even though there are those like anti-war elements, Biden himself is pretty much committed to supporting the Ukraine cause.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah, Truman. I would say the president who most resembles Truman in modern times is probably Carter, because Carter was a moderate Democrat who the liberal wing of the party just couldn't stand him. They had other choices, people like Jerry Brown and others, and so he was a moderate there, and in a way, Biden was considered a sort of a moderate, and I'm not quite sure where I don't really know. I can't really judge Biden as a. I mean, I don't know where his. I don't. And the support for Ukraine is just a. I mean, it seems to be very much sort of a reflex, Cold War reflex, isn't it? I mean, it's suddenly Russia's the enemy again, and 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 uh, and that's the fault of Vladimir Putin, who was. I mean, that's the big question. Why would Putin have undertake such an expensive? I guess he thought he was going to win, right? I guess he thought he was going to wrap it up in a couple of days.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah, because it's an historic blunder of the sort of like with Brezhnev in Afghanistan. It's just historically stupid.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think to your assessment that the Republican Party has become a cult of the unnamed figure, it has the isolationist tendencies has certainly crept up and entrenched the party of the GOP, almost as a reflexive view on what Biden is doing. Oh, yeah, Biden is supporting Ukraine, and we don't want to do that, and therefore.
Well, actually, that's actually one of the more interesting splits. The Republican Party does have some divisions, and that's one of them. People like Mitch McConnell and if John McCain were alive, these are the people who still support the old Republican, support NATO and all and that's still there. But yeah, but you do have this other side of the party, which is something new and sort of the neo-isolationist, but it's a very vocal group now. Yeah, when you can there's a guy named Tucker Carlson is one of
Oh
those.
yes, yes.
The most vocal person. Why are we sending money down this rat hole when we could be building roads and airports and so on? And that's not a bad argument. But we should. But this. But we're. But that's an appealing argument. There are other. But it isn't. It shouldn't be an either or thing. But anyway, that strain is definitely there in the party.
Mm-hmm. So another point that you touch on is Truman's records and views on civil rights issues. And
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, the military under the presidency of Harry Truman was integrated way before public schools and other facilities, right?
Well, yeah, Truman announced that the desegregation. It didn't happen until Eisenhower became president. I mean, it was announced, but it didn't happen. Yeah, the government offices and the military, by executive order, were desegregated. Then the reality was, say, happened under Eisenhower one term later. Yes, and the school desegregation came with the Supreme Court ruling, and that was later still.
Mm-hmm.
So that wasn't Truman.
Okay.
And Truman was that was just to sort of say, at one point Truman said there are two people sitting in this chair. There's the president of the United States and there's Harry Truman. And when it came to certain things, when it came to desegregation, when it came to liberalization of civil rights, liberalization of sort of rights for African Americans, that was the president, because that wasn't Truman's personal view, but he knew it was the right thing to do. And when it came to other issues, Truman's emotions would take over, and it was Truman speaking. But Truman was very good on civil rights, and he gave a very important speech before the Lincoln Memorial, and basically calling for more equality in jobs and opportunity and so on in a sort of powerful way. And that was the speech that basically drove the Southern Democrats out of the party.
Well, Another important momentous decision that happened under the Truman presidency is the recognition of the nascent state of Israel, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary of its founding. And according to, I guess, Israeli Zionist historiography, Truman came to this view under rather, vocal opposition from the, I guess, the national security / foreign policy establishment at that time, which included George Kennan and George Marshall. So give us an overview of what that battle.
And Dean Acheson.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. No, that's true. What I said just a moment ago, that it was Harry Truman, not the president, who made this decision. It was Truman's emotions that did it. It was Truman, seeing pictures of the refugees in Europe after the Holocaust and so on. That's who made this decision about Israel. And yes, everyone said don't do it. This will lead to years or endless violence between Arabs and Jews in the Middle East. The Secretary of the Navy Burns of Forrestal said, oil is the lifeblood of our economy. That's going to be. There are all kinds of warnings again. Don't do it. But Truman did it because he thought it was the right thing to do, and that's Truman too. He was a man who was also sometimes guided by his emotions, and what he thought was the right thing to do.
So a concluding question: so did history happen to Truman, or did Truman make history, or it's a bit of both?
It's both. It's both. I mean, Truman made decisions that made history, but history made him for sure. I mean, the Russia's aims definitely affected America's policy, and the atomic bomb affected everything. That was so it was both. It was both. But Truman had a role to play in American history, and for the most part, it was a good role for all his mistakes. I think his huge mistake was Korea, as I may have suggested, but he did a lot of things right.
On that note, thank you very much, Jeffrey Frank, the author of The Trials of Harry Truman, for joining this program.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Good questions.